And with that, I know we have 5 minutes, but I think we will start and let Sharang get a little situated and start on his time. And so I'd like to introduce Sharang Biswas. He's an 8-time award-winning game designer. He has exhibited at museums, galleries, game festivals around the world. His game credits include Avatar Legends, Pathfinder, Vampire the Masquerade, and more. His fiction and poetry have appeared in Lightspeed, Augur, and Strange Horizons, among others. The co-editor of Honey and Hot Wax, an anthology of erotic art games, and the author of the novella The Iron Below Remembers. He teaches games at NYU and Fordham University, and most importantly, he is the winner of Right Club from last night. So we pick him good here at NarraScope. We know what we're doing. But with that, I'll invite Sharang up, and thank you so much for being here with us. Sharang Biswas.
Today I'm talking about speculation by design, refocusing imagination and storytelling within the analog RPG. So, as JD mentioned, I'm primarily a tabletop designer, tabletop analog designer, because I do LARPs as well, which is not really tabletop. I've done some digital work. That's not my main focus. I have to remind my intro students every year. Sometimes I tell my students, if you are a computer science major, you might know more coding than me, just so you know, right? This talk will focus on that. Hopefully it'll be accessible to everyone. If not, I just have a lovely voice and you can enjoy that. And my linguistics professor told me I have a hybrid accent, so you can enjoy that. We're going to do a fairly long background. The background's actually quite long. Then we're going to talk about argument. We're going to go into the affordances of like what my argument leads to. And then I'm going to end with a little example of a current project I'm working on that uses some of these ideas. So you can situate yourself that way. So we're going to start with our background. So Brindlewood Bay is a lovely little RPG where you play elderly women in a book club in a small seaside town in Massachusetts who love solving murder mysteries. It's inspired by things like Agatha Christie novels and the Murder, She Wrote TV show and things like that. Now, Brindlewood Bay, I really enjoy. I've even run the game in French for the Dartmouth French department students once. There's a French translation, so you can get that. But it's a really interesting game for a number of reasons. But something that's quite interesting spurred one of the ideas that went into this talk, right? So in Brindlewood Bay, you're doing stuff, you roll dice, the dice are high, good things happen. If the dice are not high, bad things happen, which is quite classic for TTRPGs. Now, some of the bad things that can happen is you can just die, right? You roll badly, the GM can say, oh, you're chasing the person, well, you're 77, you trip, fall, break your hip, and die, right? Like that could just happen. But Brindlewood Bay has an interesting mechanic called putting on a crown. Quote, after a die roll and after an outcome has been narrated, the player can choose to put on a crown and increase their die result by 1 success tier. In that case, we narrate a different result, and what was previously narrated does not occur. We say it's a different timeline. The key here is we narrate the result, and then we narrate the alternate result. So if you roll your dice, let's say I roll snake eyes, I won't say, oh, but I'm putting on a crown, so it becomes a not snake eyes. No, the GM will first say, you trip over a dog, the dog bites you, you get rabies, and you die. And then I say, no, I'm going to put on a crown, and I'm going to upgrade my snake eyes to a successful dice roll, right? And this is very specifically, you can see it here, laid out in the rules, right? And the book says, so this is from the book, why does the keeper fully narrate a result that they know the player is just going to discard by putting on a crown? Like, why does the rulebook tell you to do this? Because it's fun. The crown lets us glimpse different timelines, play them out, feel them, experience the anguish and terror, and then do something different. Now, this is quite significant. Traditional old school RPGs, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, it is not the only traditional RPG, but it is the most famous one, don't actually mechanize that kind of thing in the rules, right? The Dungeon Master's Guide might say, these are some ways you can narrate. But the rules never say narrate this, not this. Brindlewood Bay specifically says this is how you should narrate. First, narrate the failure. Then, if they put on the crown, say, but that didn't happen. That could have, but it didn't. This happened instead. This is quite significant because this becomes a formal game mechanic. Many of you might be familiar with Haneke Leblanc and Zubek's MDA, even though one of them has been outed as an abusive boss. Their paper is still a good paper. But the idea of turning this statement, this like what you say, into a mechanic is a significant thing within tabletop role-playing games. Because most of the time, tabletop role-playing games concern themselves about the rules written in the book, concern a lot about what's known as the crunch. Okay? So in the Weird Cunt Companion 2012, Emily Care-Boss has this really lovely article. It's a free online companion. You can just download it. It's full of really, really interesting work. Emily Care-Boss has an article where she popularizes the idea of fluff versus crunch, right? So the crunch are the mechanics, right? What we think of, like, yeah, roll the dice, what's your armor class, whatever. While the fluff is what's often considered the color, the narrative, the storytelling, like, yeah, you rolled a 17 on your die, but what does that sound like? What does that sound like? It is my sword swinging through the air, making a whooshing noise, right? That's the fluff, right? Think of it as flavor text in a magic card. And Emily Care-Boss says, quote, there is a dismissive quality to fluff. If it's not connected to mechanics, if it doesn't help increase your advantage during play, it's derided as color, right? A lot of energy in the game design, critiquing, and playing world, all three goes into thinking about the mechanics, right? In TTRPG, people value the fact that we're rolling dice. What kind of die? How many dice? How many cards are we drawing, right? We value armor class. We value what Evan Turner calls, quote, quantifying bodily integrity, which is like your health, right? Like, it is quite weird, right? Like, we really care about the fact that a sword does 1 point of damage. If any of you have ever been hit by a sword, you are probably dead, right? We focus on these crunch mechanics. And some people might argue, well, that's because of the history of TTRPGs, right? You might be familiar with the idea that, oh, TTRPGs are said to have descended from Kriegspiel on the top left, right? The German war games that were meant for generals and people to simulate war. It's descended from Little Wars, H.G. Wells, yes, that H.G. Wells, his like tabletop miniature games, and that led to Chainmail, the precursor of D&D, which then led to D&D, and that is what that gave rise to modern phenomenon of role-playing game, right? Like, so D&D is the granddaddy of these, right? Now, that's not wrong, but that's not entirely right either, right? As Renee Schalliger says, D&D was indeed not the first RPG, but it was certainly a decisive step in the formulation of a new kind of text route, right? So he's citing Ron Edwards here, the RPG designer, who is brilliant but kind of kooky. But it is not entirely correct to say that D&D is the origin of all TTRPGs. It's very significant, right? But it's not necessarily the origin, right? Quote, on a sociological level, the emergence of a new medium cannot be attributed to individuals, as it was the result of a pervasive trend in hobbyist sub-society, right? You can say that TTRPGs descend from D&D. They descend from random pretend play. They descend from when people would write into old magazines asking for war game companion, but would write as though they were the villains in James Bond. They descend from the Bronte sisters writing letters to each other, role-playing as kings of the Habsburg Empire and things like that, right? The root of RPGs isn't necessarily crunchy combat, even though it does borrow a lot, but the root of RPGs isn't necessarily that. And while we do make distinctions between crunchy, old-school RPGs like Draw Steel, where the intro of the book literally says, you will need a grid-based map and miniatures to play this game, and then very nicely says, if that's not your what you like, here are other RPGs you can play. Very few RPGs do that. We make a distinction between that kind of crunchy RPG and the kind of games often known as story games, right? Like Dialect, where you play a society dying that's trying to preserve its culture and language, right? We make the distinction that, oh, these are more crunchy, tactical, these are more story, right? However, this division, I contend, is not as deep as we might like to think, right? After all, this thing over here, which is a very detailed character sheet with numbers and procedures, this is for 13th Age, a lovely RPG. At the table, something happens to turn this into this, right? This is fan art that I found online. I did not cite, my bad. I do have the citation in my speaker notes if you wanted. It is from Reddit. There is an imaginative leap at the table, because at the table, I am not a spreadsheet. There are spreadsheet games. Alexander King at NYU teaches a lovely class on spreadsheets and games. But at the table, I'm not just spreadsheet. I am this half-elf paladin warrior dude, right? And even if you're the kind of gamer who is like, no, I really care about tactics. I focus on optimization. This is a crown of candy, if anyone knows that. I really focus on optimization and numbers and But do you really, right? Evan Turner says this idea of balanced combat is false, right? He cites Merrick Blackman, quote, when people want balanced combat in D&D, they don't want combat that is 50-50% chance of either side winning. They want combat that the PCs will almost always win, but feels like they might lose. As you might expect, this is a bit tricky to pull off. If you make combat too hard, they're like, oh God, frustration. If you make it too easy, like this is boring. If you make it too balanced, then there'll be a 50-50%. You will lose half your combats in your D&D game, and people then tend to perceive that as the deck stacked against you. So even if you're the kind of person who says, I want tactics and numbers and I'm a alpha male who cares about data, right? No, you probably just want the story of the combat. You want the story that those numbers are telling you, right? So, putting together these, right? We've talked about this fluff and this crunch, and we've talked about Brindlewood Bay, that's mechanizing the kinds of statements you're supposed to say and not say. So this brings up the question, well, what is a game mechanic? This might sound like an esoteric, dumb question from your intro theory class. It is definitely in my intro theory class that I teach. But it is kind of significant here, because when I teach my experimental RPGs class in fall, I'm going to teach in the coming fall, sometimes I've had students be like, oh, Professor, Dialect, the game I told you about languages, Dialect, it isn't a full-on game, right? It's just talking and telling us how to talk. But then D&D games have rules about talking and telling you how to talk. People just don't think of them as significant mechanics. But the sentence, roll for initiative, is an extremely significant sentence, right? As Turner says, that iconic phrase means two things. Whoops, typo. The first meaning is procedural, right? When I say roll for initiative, I'm telling everyone, pull your dice up, roll your dice, now this means something. But the second meaning is liminal. Within the combat phase of D&D, the rules of the game are now different, right? Now, everything happens in 6-second increments, right? Everything now has to happen in turn order. The rules become much more precise and codified, where in other parts it can be a bit more like loosey-goosey, and the GM can be like, sure, that works, sure, right? So the phrase roll for initiative is very much a significant game mechanic, which isn't that crunchy. It is a language-based mechanic that puts us in a new phase, right? So which verbs are considered game mechanics is a significant thing that affects how we think of and how we play our games. Now, this is something I've talked about a lot. This is from a lecture I gave in 2024 in Clara's class, I think, about games as verb. Like, I think very much about what crunchy things are we doing, what verbs are we doing, right? There's a lot of thought about this. For example, Ian Bellamy's article on Analogue game studies has this lovely examination of the experiential side effects of rolling dice versus drawing cards, and they feel different even if the mathematics of them are the same. Really, really cool. And lots of different RPGs try and do different things with their game verbs, right? Agon, for example, you only roll dice 3 or 4 times in the entire 4-hour session, but the act of rolling dice is very long. Like, you have to make a pool of dice, you do all this stuff, right? Fight with Spirit, which is a RPG about anime sports. Like, it's all about like the camaraderie and sports. It's made by 2 lesbian Australian lesbian game designers. It is brilliant. That uses a really interesting card mechanic to try and simulate the competitive tug-of-war nature of a sports game, right? Go Knicks, I suppose. I'm a New Yorker, my citizenship card says. 10 Candles is like, oh, our game mechanic is going to be about lighting and blowing candles, right? There are dice in the game, but like there are these candles, 10 of them, in fact. What do we do, right? Starcrossed uses a Jenga, though they can't say Jenga, they say tumbling blocks. A Jenga tower to simulate the precarity of being with someone that you really, really, really want to bang, but you can't for very, very good reasons, right? Oh no, if the tower falls over, right? Excuse me. My game Verger uses cooking. It's actually making a salad in order to cast witchy spells for revenge, right? And so a lot of games are very concerned about these physical verbs in them that constitute the mechanics, the play, right? So what is the role of these other, like the thing of like what you're allowed to say or not, right? Cameron Kunzelman, in his book, The World is Born from Zero, which, by the way, really influenced my thinking process about this talk in particular, asks early on in the book, before I get to my argument, let us talk about what is a game mechanic, right? This is a serious game studies book. I think Cameron Kunzelman's training is in philosophy, if I remember. So he goes like, this is what Zimmerman and Salen say. This is what Miguel Sicard say. This is what Zimmerman and all these people say, right? So he goes into a lot of detail. But then he asks, quote, is interpretation a mechanic or simply an epiphenomenon of human interaction with mechanics, right? Can the thought that I'm putting into the game count as a mechanic? Now, some authors make a distinction. They're like, I am rolling dice. The fact that I'm thinking about dice is not a game mechanic. That's just something you do. However, the counterexample you could think of is a puzzle, right? If you say that the heart of doing Wordle is choosing letters, that's not really capturing what you do when you are playing Wordle, right? You are thinking of words. You are processing what the clues of the yellow and the green are doing for you, right? The heart of a puzzle game is the thought that goes into the puzzle. You usually put more time into thinking than you do typing a letter, right? And so Kunzelman ultimately says, quote, if we reduce these interactions to mere verbs or the rote physical tasks that allow them to take place, we lose the actual description of what is happening in the intentional interaction, right? The interpretation and the thought you are putting into the physical verb, the rolling the die, the drawing the card, the choosing your tactic, right? The thought that goes into it, Kunzelman argues that it is very much part of the game mechanic and significantly so, right? And so that brings me finally to my argument, right? So my thesis question is, instead of physical verbs, what if we focus on speculation, storytelling, or imaginative thought as the driving mechanic in TTRPG? When you describe TTRPGs, we often say, oh, that's a D20 system. Oh, that's a Forged in the Dark system. It uses the Blade in the Dark dice mechanic of D6s. Oh, that's a GURPS system. It uses the point buy of GURPS, right? If none of these mean anything to you, play more TTRPGs. That's a thriving industry. But instead of focusing on the physical verbs that we're doing, rolling dice, drawing cards, etc., what if we refocus our attention on the act act of speculating, imagining, and storytelling as our driving mechanics. Now, I'm not saying let's ignore the other verbs completely. I absolutely do not. I think of those other kinds of verbs a lot. But what if we reframe the core physical mechanics of TTRPG as supplementary elements in service of the story, the atmosphere, and the emotion, right? Again, this isn't a major thing. This isn't like all games should now do this. This is, what if we start thinking of speculation first, of imagination first, and then think, okay, so then what dice should I use if I want dice? But I have definitely designed games where I've started the game, I'm going to put dice. I literally wrote out an integral once for a game, like this is the probability curve I'm going to have. I play tested this game at Peoria University with all these really famous game designers. The designer of Mothership said this was not good, and I'm like, I am so embarrassed. And I just cut out the dice ultimately, right? Because I was thinking dice first when I should be thinking of maybe speculation first, right? And some games do this. So we already talked about Brindlewood Bay, right? Brindlewood Bay, this mystery solving game where you are elderly women solving cozy mysteries, right? By the way, the tentacles are there because there's an undercurrent of like Cthulhu cult activity going on, but that's only part of the game, right? Cthulhu, whatever, forget about Cthulhu. Now, in this game, you're solving these murder mysteries, but a really, really neat thing is neither the game designer, Jason Cordova, nor the adventure writers, one of them being me, nor the GM at the table know who the murderer is, right? The murderer is decided procedurally. As you play and investigate and search for clues, the GM has something like this, a list of bullet point clues that they can arbitrarily hand out to the players, right? So for example, a clue might be, this is from my adventure that I wrote, a clue might be a racy photo or video of one of the students. It could be a roll of sturdy wire for doll making in an unusual place. It could be an overheard gossip about the museum going out of business, right? The GM arbitrarily chooses to sprinkle these in whenever the players make investigations. And at the end of the game, the players at the table look at all the clues they have and collectively decide, well, given these clues, which of the NPCs we've met could be the murderer. And that is the murderer in the end, right? So you decide this. Quote, there are no canonical solutions to Brindlewood Bay mysteries. The solution is whatever the players come up with at the table based on the clues at hand. This is meant to simulate those great scenes in mystery stories where the protagonists are puzzling aloud about who might have done it, right? If you've watched or read any Hercule Poirot mystery, you know that at the end he always brings people into a room, shuts the door and says, now let me waffle about how I figured out who the murderer is, right? And so Jason Cordova is like, I would like to emulate that. He went fiction first and said, what mechanics, what procedures are in service of that, right? Similarly, the game Tacklebox, which came out, the final version came out recently, I did a playtest version like years ago, is a really unusual LARPish game where you play, it's a two-player game, you play two friends fishing, okay? Quote, this is the truth. You are just a pair of friends out in a small boat together fishing. But more importantly, whatever doubts or concerns you might have internally, try to continue acting as if you are just two people fishing. So the game mechanically says it constrains your conversation. You are only allowed to say things that you might say if you are out fishing with your friend, like your pal, your buddy, right? However, as you play the game, you draw cards that you are not allowed to show the other person, right? This is the highest res image of a card I could find. This fishing trip isn't really happening right now. It's a memory from long ago that you are reliving in your mind, right? So this might be the card I draw. JD, however, his card might say, you two are AI agents created by a supercomputer trying to understand the meaning of extinct human life. This fishing trip is a simulation, an attempt to do that, right? Or we might draw a card that says, you are members of an old and nearly dead cult, and this fishing trip is one of the elaborate rituals that you must do every year, right? Now, again, remember this part. Whatever doubts or concerns you might have, you must continue acting as if you're two people fishing. And the other person does not know what my card says. So an external viewer of this game will see me and JD sitting, and I'm like, I love fish. I wonder why I love fish. Because in my head, I'm like, why did humans like fish? Let's simulate this circumstance and see, right? JD might be like, I love that we do this every year. This is such an important ritual to me, right? Because JD's like, yes, we must do this ritual or Cthulhu will rise, right? And to an outside person, this is a boring thing. The heart of the game is happening inside my head, right? No one else will ever know the main beating pulse of this game, which is happening entirely in my head. So this game, Tackleback like Jay Walton, absolutely centers speculation as its core mechanic, right? Without that, the game is essentially meaningless. It's just me being like, what kind of bait should we use? And JD, who is an actual New Yorker and has lived in places, might be like, well, I actually know about fishing. I'll be like, okay. Right? So again, this game centers speculation. So, now what? Right? I've made this theoretical framework of, well, what if we consider the physical verbs as supplementary and we consider the speculation as the heart of it? Now what, right? So, like, we all know about the humanities. We all have made jokes about, oh, the humanities is basically masturbating to other humanities scholars, right? So we're all like, wee, circle jerk, we're so cool, right? But I always consider that no, the humanities, one, are intrinsically interesting because that's what makes us human, is they're called the humanities. But also, players and designers can use ideas to influence their play, which, remember, every act of playing a TTRPG is an artistic act, and in their design space. Like, how do we design thinking about these things? So I think that this framework of thinking of TTRPGs provides us with a number of affordances we can use when doing game design or when playing, right? Now, these are them. The other thing that this framework allows us is it allows us to look at other storytelling media that make us speculate and draw ideas and parallels from those media into our game design. Can we borrow from film or television or oral history or sacred chanting? All this kind of thing. I don't go into sacred chanting, sorry. I don't know enough about it, right? And I use one key example to frame the discussion, and that example is heated rivalry, right? Of course, I'm going to use heated rivalry. It is in the zeitgeist. Everyone knows about it. If you haven't watched it, please do. The book is... Watch the show. It's also interesting because, one, there's a lot we can learn and think about in romance. And the only reason we prioritize Joseph Campbell's hero's journey instead of this is misogyny, right? We are not allowed to think about romance as much. Luckily, people allow me to because they're like, oh, but you're a faggot. You can do that. It's fine. If I were a straight dude, they'd be like, why are you thinking about this, right? Being gay is so fun. You get so many free passes. You get to do so many things. People are like, oh, but it's because you're gay. Bless, right? But also, romance stories have very interesting structures. I have an expert in the audience in front of me who's nodding. Have very interesting structures that are interesting. Sorry about that. That are worthy of study, analysis, and can be used in other kinds of media. Right. So we are going to use heated rivalry to talk about choices and endings, tone management, character arcs, narrative pacing, and something I kind of decided to call asides, right? Our first point, choices and endings, right? In the narrative space, video game, I know about them. In the narrative space, I haven't even finished it yet. I'm barely in the first act. Ask them. Somebody else played it 3 times. It's like, you still haven't finished this, Sharang? And I'm like, Naomi said the second part is not that good, so I'm going to believe my department chair. We really like prioritizing this idea of prioritizing. We really like this idea of choices, right? One of the selling points of BG3 was that, wow, there's so many different choices you can do, at least in the first act. Wow, it feels like a tabletop game, because people talk about tabletop RPGs as it's like a sandbox, you can do whatever you want, and we've just seen some examples where you can't, right? But people like this idea of free choice, open choice, choices that change the ending, right? Everyone remember blah, blah, blah will remember this, right? From those games. I know a video game, right? They call Telltale, right? The Telltale game, right? Blah, blah, blah will remember that. It'll affect your ending. It won't. They're great games, but they won't affect your ending. We love this. But romance stories teach us, you know what? Endings are not that important. Anytime you pick up a traditional romance novel, you know the ending, right? If it's a traditional romance novel, you know the ending. The Romance Writers of America, which I think is kind of collapsed as an organization. Again, our expert is nodding. It's kind of collapsed, but for a while on their website, they had this definition that a romance novel, by definition, must have a happy ending, right? Sort of a happy ending, right? When my first book came out last year, The Iron Below Remembers by Sharang Biswas, I was telling my publisher, I'm like, should I talk about it as a romance? He's like, no, because it doesn't conform to the structure and definitions of a traditional romance, even though the heart of the story is about a relationship. Yes, between an archaeologist and a superhero, but it's still a relationship, right? But we know the ending of all romance novels. The people are going to get together, they're going to be happy. I'm sorry it's really warm, but I'm hot, so it works. And that's a good thing, right? This is not a bad thing. Romance novels aren't designed to surprise you in that way. They're designed so that you know the ending, you trust that it's going to be happy, and you can go on that journey knowing exactly where your destination is, right? Sometimes it is good to know where you're going, right? And so we can use that in the gaming world. There are some very, very significant games whose ending the players know right from the start, right? 10 Candles that I mentioned before, in most versions of the game, you all die at the end. And in fact, the entire world dies at the end, right? In most scenarios of 10 Candles, there's an apocalypse happening and everyone on the earth is going to die, right? And yet, you still play the game. Quote, "Though the characters' endeavor may be doomed to fail, it is our duty to make this story of their struggle as meaningful as possible," right? Stephen Dewey says, we know we're going to die, but in the game, our characters don't know that, and we must meaningfully make them struggle or the game fails. This is quite a successful game, right? And this is one which you blow out the candle. It's really interesting. And it still feels tense and engaging and oh no, what's going to happen next, even though we know ultimately we're all going to die, right? So these endings and choosing what affects the ending, is it overrated? Maybe. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It could be a bit overrated. I'm hurting my throat. Sorry. I will speak less loudly. And so endings and choices lead to different endings. Learn from romance novels. But also, the choices themselves, right? We think about, okay, well, we have to give lots of choices, like blah, blah, blah. This is a game I'm working on right now. I'm working with Lucian Khan and Michael Addison. It's a game about drag queens road tripping across America, but you're also wizards. And so you're road tripping to find Atlantis, because that's where the sweetest party is. Right? And that's the ending, right? The end, you may or may not reach Atlantis, right? And I say right a lot. Apologies, right? So when you reach the ending, you have a series of prompts, and I had to think very carefully about, well, how am I presenting these choices to players, right? Right. You at the end, you're in Atlantis, you get to perform Atlantis. I didn't ask in the end, what's your performance like, right? This is a very broad space. It's actually quite a challenging question to answer, what do you do next? It's quite challenging. The possibility space is too open. in a good RPG design, you want to be able to bound and constrain these choices. So instead of what's your performance like, you might ask, describe the impromptu performance you give that becomes a touch point for every future performance at this party from here on out, right? That guides the player to a certain kind of interesting answer. Or who do you meet at the party? This literally was a question I added. I changed it to which movers and shakers of the supernatural world hit on you, and does that lead to more? So these kind of, if you focus speculation and storytelling, what might seem trivial, oh, it's just a prompt. There are designers in this audience who think very, very carefully and have written a lot about how do we write prompts and how do we write pick lists and things like that. But because if we focus on storytelling and speculation as our core, these become important things to look at that influence quite strongly, subtly maybe, but strongly, players' experience and emotional arcs at the game. Right? So the next thing is tone management. This is my favorite screenshot of this entire TV show. Right? Tone management. Everyone loves the show because of stuff on the left, right? Everyone's like, yeah, we get to see these hot ripped dudes fucking, so fun, right? But one of the reasons the show works is because it also balances really well with the stuff on the right. Right? These not tiny, but these moments of thoughtfulness, of emotion, of interaction. Dr. Catherine Costello-Jones, who is in the audience today, and I have this like pet theory we came up with once that we love reading and writing fan fiction smut, partially because the work of relationship and character building has been done already for you. You can read the smut and you already have an idea about what makes the characters tick and why you like them and all that stuff. And a writer doesn't have to do the quite hard labor of character development, which is a challenging thing to do. Trust me, I'm a published writer. And so when I'm reading fan fiction smut, the emotion part work is in my head and I can now enjoy the titillating parts. Right? And recently I went to one of my swim team friends took me to the Heated Rivalry parody musical in New York, which by the way is happening in the same venue as Sleep No More used to. So that's really interesting. And I was musical, and the musical is framed. It starts off with these 3 Midwestern moms, all named Susan, with really comical accents, and they're like, yeah, this is why we're watching this show. And the first song about why we like this show, we like hockey players with big butts sucking dick, but they're sad, right? But they're sad is a really significant component of this, because the smutty stuff would not titillate if it weren't for I mean, they probably would, right? We're horny, we're human. Not everyone is, but I am. But it would not titillate as effectively, let's say, if it wasn't grounded in this emotional humanitarian, that's a different word, humanity-ish, that's a great word, humanity-ish moment, right? And some RPGs take advantage of this. Slug Blaster by Mikey Ham is a zany, really cool RPG. I just finished a campaign of it with some friends. It is a game where you play teenagers doing the hot new sport of hoverboarding across space-time into parallel dimensions and doing sweet tricks there for the likes on social media, right? So you're jumping into these dimensions and you're doing tricks there, and like monsters sometimes appear and you get scared and run away or whatever. You do all this stuff in these dimensions. And while a lot of the game, you could, for example, go into the alien world of Thenis Spar and like grind off of all the ledges and stuff you see there, a lot of the game forces you to set scenes in Hillview, your town, that's so boring that it doesn't even have a hill. It's called Hillview because you have a view of a hill from your town. And it forces you to make scenes happen, it has two kinds of scenes. You have these zany scenes where you're doing weird skateboarding and tentacle monsters and math panthers that square root your body. What does that mean? Oh, I'll figure it out when you play the game, right? But it also has these mundane moments of your parents being like, son, I need to talk to you about slug blasting. It's quite dangerous. Also, are you gay? Right? And by the way, you can go to that website. You can go to learn more at safeslugblast.org. That is a website you can go to. Turn the sound down. So this game makes you alternate between the zaniness and the mundanity. And it does a lot of things. It creates a nice rhythm in the game, but it also grounds the zaniness. My players said that some of their favorite parts of the game was getting to these mundane moments. And also, coming up with zany things is challenging, right? It's cognitive work. And so grounding it with the not as challenging, like meat space our world, helps relieve the cognitive load of having to come up with monsters and what are they doing and what weird thing is happening on Thanaspar and what does the waking pits look like, blah, 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 right? So it really helps it helps support the other part of the speculation, but also is fun to do on its own as well. Next, we get to the idea of character arcs. Now, romance novels are famous for having predefined arcs. There's all the different models. This is Pamela Regis's model. I've taught with this text before. I might change it up for next spring. We'll see what Clara says. But there are these specific things. Pamela Regis says these specific beats always happen in a romance story, right? And what's significant is that these specific moments are less concerned with plot and more concerned with what is happening with the characters, right? How are the characters growing, changing, learning, all that. And Quinns, who is a famous games critic and reviewer, talks about this idea that traditionally TTRPGs are very good at helping you do world building and character creation, right? They give you this cool world, they give you this cool tool set, make character, but it isn't actually, but these TTRPGs are not actually very good at helping you tell an interesting story about your character. The rule books tend to be like, yeah, do it. You'll tell a story, right? Here's how to make a character. Here's how to do these procedures, and here's a cool world. A story will arise from there. And Quinn says, but it doesn't always. And Slug Blaster mechanizes the idea of character arcs. So remember I said that these mundane moments you have to do? There's a very specific way you do these mundane moments. You spend in-game currency to have these arcs. So if you're playing the Guts character, you start off with, you're scouted by a sponsor. You become a fan favorite. Then it becomes, wait, but star power, more attention, special offers, and then, you have a big fight with your crew. You get Fracture, you get Doom, which are the negative currencies. You get Slam, which is the negative currency. So the game mechanizes the fact that an interesting character arc has to go up and down. And if it doesn't, then isn't that interesting? And then finally, you get to turn down the huge offer, or do something else, and then you lose your Doom, you lose everything, but you get 7 style for the crew, blah, blah, blah. So the game not only makes you do these scenes, it uses the in-game currency, the crunch, right? The actual tokens that you're getting and things like that, in order to make you tell interesting stories. So again, this game is focusing its attention on speculation and storytelling. And then we have narrative pacing, right? So everyone loves to talk about how much sex there is in Heated Rivalry. The first 15 minutes has one of the most interesting sex scenes in the show. Jacob Tierney, initially, when he was pitching the show to American producers, they told him, well, the characters should have their first kiss in episode 4. And he's like, no, I want them to fuck in episode 1, in the first quarter of the episode, right? And he did that for very specific reasons. These characters are grappling with hookup culture and secrecy, and we can't really have a relationship, so let's just hook up instead, and that makes up for it, and then they fall in love later, right? They're sad. And so Jacob Cheney is very carefully thinking about pacing and rhythm. Traditionally, romance stories are like meet cute, blah, 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 and then they hook up later, right? They have their first kiss partway through, and then they have sex later on. I just finished reading a romance novel called Love, Hate, and Clickbait. And that's very traditional. They kiss in the middle, and then later they hook up. Jacob Cheney's like, no, we're going to change these rhythms because pacing is a very important part of storytelling. And again, traditional RPGs do not tell you how to do pacing. They give you antagonists, they give you challenges and say, do them. Pacing will happen, right? But some RPGs have learned, right? Lovecraft-esque by Josh Fox and Becky Anderson. Now, this is the first edition, because I have the first edition, not the second edition. Is a game where you're one character, it's like multiplayer, but it's one character you're controlling who's investigating a Lovecraftian mystery, and specifically it's called Lovecraft-esque because they have an essay at the back of the book rejecting Lovecraft as a racist and horrible person, and they talk about this, and they're like, that's why it's Lovecraft-esque. But the game is this cosmic horror where you're a person exploring, trying to find what's happening, what's this mystery, and they have a rule of creeping horror. Quote, everything must be rationally explicable, and there may not be any overt attacks, including theft, sabotage, or other destruction, or any kind of violence, including discovering dead bodies, until the phase of the game that's known as the final horror, right? Anderson and Fox very deliberately are like, how do these cosmic horror stories work? We are trying to replicate that, and we are going to make a mechanic, because again, this is very much a game mechanic, right? It is constraining what you can do in the game. So again, dice are not the only mechanic, but they're making a mechanic that controls how we pace the game, how we pace the story, because again, pacing is very, very important to it. I'm sure many of us have played RPGs, I mean, I'm actually not sure about this, but some of us in this room have played RPGs where at the end we're like, oh, and then it ended, kind of, in like a damp squib sort of way, right? But if we again center speculation and storytelling, it affords us, I should say, to think about this kind of thing. And then finally, we have this idea of asides, right? Where the realm of literature, and this is based on a book, but also film, the realm of non-interactive storytelling, I should say, allows for all these random asides, right? Heated Rivalry Episode 3 is a full book. Jacob Cheney took book 1 of this series and stuffed it into episode 3 of this show in order to comment on the rest of the story. It's actually quite brilliantly done. It allows us to think about, well, what is different here in this story in episode 3 versus the rest of what we've been seeing? It's a very interesting and deliberate choice, right? So it's an aside. It is going in a random tangential direction, not random, arbitrary tangential direction in order to influence our experience of the storytelling. And some RPGs have taken this into account. The Between, also by Jason Cordova, is a Victorian monster game where they're like werewolves and vampires and things in Victorian England, and you are like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen style investigators trying to stop them. But there's this thing called the Unseen. It's a pun, get it? Unseen, right? No? Okay. And it's a specific scene that you do at a point in the game. Your investigators do stuff in the day, and they do stuff, and then the unseen happens. A scene that takes place in parallel with what the hunters are doing during the night phase. And it's meant to show a side of London that only rears its head when the sun sets. But crucially, and he writes, to emphasize the point, the unseen has no direct connection to the main story. He goes on to say, you are not allowed to include the characters in the unseen. You are not allowed to include locations you visit in the unseen. You show And then in a random brothel in London, this is happening. And then in a random schoolhouse in London, this is happening. And the point, there's some mechanics about bringing in visual imagery from the unseen to the rest of the game. And the point is to build the atmosphere of your location, of London at this time, right? These A-sides help build the tone, atmosphere, and world of the game in a way that's not really affecting your characters in any way. Next example is from also Stephen Dewey's game To Serve Her Wintry Hunger. Stephen Dewey also made 10 Candles, and it was very long, and I only have a physical copy, and I wasn't going to type this up for y'all. You're not worth it. Pay me even more, and I'll do that. And in this game, you play 4 spirits. You are either fear, flame, hunger, or cold, and you are in a wintry forest, and there is a human trapped in the forest during a blizzard, and your job is to capture this human to feed to your mistress, who is a witch. It's a one-shot game. And you're doing this, and you can succeed, in which case she rewards you, and you can fail, in which case she punishes you. But your characters are very, very unequal. If you are flame, the witch loves you. You're her favorite. Everything is amazing. If you are fear, at the start of the game, the witch hates you, you are pathetic, you are weak, you have no abilities, you hate the witch. At the end of the game, if you fail to capture the human, if you are flame, you get punished, sure. If you are fear, this is what the book says. If you are fear, speak of how you were the one that helped the human escape. Speak to her of her foulness and of your unceasing dreams. Speak to her of the flowers from your village and her wicked ways come to an end. Speak to her of the hidden weakness you have found in her spells, the hole in her wintry contracts, her bane, poison, and destruction. Speak to her of how you have waited for this day. Speak to her of how soon it will be she that bows and grovels and begs at your feet. Speak to her of how you will be free. But then, Spirit, in truth, we have no time for such foolishness. Instead, speak only of this. How does she end you? Right? And so the game presents you with this hypothetical aside, and yet, you're at the end, you're like, no, how does she end you? Right? And again, it doesn't change the mechanic of the game. Whether or not that paragraph was there, you only say, how does she end you? And you say, well, she does this to me. But its presence changes everything, right? I know this because I have people in this room who played this game with me. And it's present, and they've eaten really bad food that I made for them. So I promise I cook good food. Come play with me, I'll make good food for you. But it's the presence of this paragraph, as an aside, changes how we perceive of the story in a very significant, and I would say poetic way. So, the affordances of centering speculation and storytelling, choices and endings, tone management, character arcs, narrative pacing, and asides. So finally, I have tried to put this into practice, and praxis, it's a cool word, into my design. One of my latest designs is Bloomfall, Here, There, and Elsewhere. It is a RPG funded by and commissioned by the National Academy of Sciences, LabX. It will be published by Scripted Games, who were here last year, but couldn't come this year, unfortunately. And there's a lot going on in this game, but one of the things we're doing is that we're conceiving this game as an interactive storybook. The structure is, if I may say so myself, innovative. And we're doing a number of things. We're having these predefined chapters that players play through, so the endings are always not known by the player, but they're set. You can't really change the ending, but our playtesting, we've done a lot. We've paid 2 groups of playtesters to play. We've done lots of playtesting at cons. Have shown people like, wait, we really like playing through, even though we know that our actions don't change the ending that much, but they change how we get to the ending, and they might change some parts of the ending. And also there are 3 possible antagonists, and partway through the game, you decide which of them is your favorite to be the main antagonist, right? We're giving players, like, how do you want to tell this story? We've taken a lot of care with our prompts and read aloud text. Like I told you with the other game, our prompts are designed to make players do world building and storytelling. We've tried to pace how character backstories evolve and how they come into play in things called mysteries, and they can see their character grow through these backstories for character arcs. The campaign structure is again set. There are 11 adventures. You play them in order. There's a choice at some point between which one you want to go down, but ultimately you go in order. So we have a paced campaign that tries to do like rising, action, climax, and all that jazz. And another thing is it has this space for asides, which are solo excursions, which are parts of the game that are solo journaling excursions, where you between sessions of the game, you go off, look at nature, like literally the game says, look at nature, whether it's an apple in your fridge or the public park or go into the wilderness, all those are nature, and do a solo journaling game. And if you do, those elements are brought back to the table and they become part of the world building. And so these asides actually affect how the game flows. And so this game has gone through so many iterations, right? The first game I was making for them when we first started 3 years ago was a game about the Arctic Circle. This is not about the Arctic Circle, right? This is a magic school game about preteens in a horror-filled magic school, right? But I've gone through many iterations, and at some point we decided we're going to focus on the storytelling as our core. And we have an interactive storybook and all that stuff, and that was because instead of physical verbs, we focused on speculation, storytelling, and imaginative thought as the driving mechanic of the TTRPG. And we thought about, so it's me and Youngsu Julian Kim, with our producer Josh Gleason, who's awesome. We have thought about these kind of things, maybe not in these words. I came up with these words when I was writing this talk, but these are things we talk about. Like, I'm like, how do we maintain this tone? Okay, we need a backstory to come to play. How do you do character arcs? And these were because we prioritized storytelling. So with that, I hope that was useful for you. It was my most theoretical talk I've ever given. Ask Samira, she's heard me give a lot of talks. This is the game, if you're interested. It's in it's in previews right now. I think they're planning on doing crowdfunding in spring. Also, my publisher would be really annoyed if I don't mention my book that came out last year. It's a finalist for an Ignite Award. You can vote for it if you want. But check that out. Otherwise, I'm Sharang Biswas on all social media except on Itch, where I'm Astrolingus, which means star-tongued, .itch.io. And thank you for the gift of your attention. I think we have 4 minutes. I timed this so well, you guys. I gave up a hookup with a divorced twink last night to practice this talk, just so you all know. I am very dedicated to my craft. He was like, I'm divorced. I'm like, well, what do you want to do? He's like, anything you want. I'm divorced. Just want to feel things. I'm like, well, I did bring my robe. But then I'm like, I'm so sorry. Conference work has got the better of me. I must do this. So you all are worth it.
Thank you, Sharang.
You are welcome.
Never forget what Sharang gave up for us.
You want to do Q&A or do you have time?
I think we have a minute for... we can do a question or two if anyone has. Happy to...
And if you don't, I will not be upset.
There's also a forum thread.
There's also the forum thread online, so feel free on the Discord, but I think we'll take one right here.
Oh, just to note, I'm not on Discord much. I get tired of it, but I will go to answer questions in here. Oh, thank you. Logan's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk, Sharon.
Who's speaking? I can't see who's speaking.
Here.
Oh.
Fundamentally, I agree with all of this, so I don't know that I can ask such an interesting question, but it strikes me that if we're designing TTRPGs in this way, it strikes me that there might be, if we're thinking about growing the hobby, there might be a kind of an access problem, meaning like, how can we get a player to play in a skillful way? What does skillful play look like? And it's much easier to put in a book, this is your paladin character, here is how they're good at combat, here's tactics you can use. then like, here's your paladin character, this is how they would speak about the good life.
Yeah.
Like, here's how they would deliver a cool monologue. It's hard
Yeah,
to write that.
I argue that is not the case, right? Because like think of Lovecraft-esque, right? Oh, it's too loud. Lovecraft-esque literally says, by the way, don't bring up anything supernatural until Act 4 of this game, right? That's quite an easy thing to write, and it's quite easy for a player who is not used to RPGs to follow, right? Like, oh, I will not mention this at all, right? Similarly, in Slug Blaster, the game is about teen drama. I might be like, well, I know nothing about teen drama, but then the game helpfully gives me a scene where you are fighting with your parents. And I'm like, great, that's teen drama. I will do this scene, right? I think we are, because we are used to certain kinds of RPGs, we automatically default to being like, oh, this is the gateway of RPGs, D&D. My sister is not a gamer. The first game I played with her ever was Bluebeard's Bride, right? Which is an RPG about intimate partner violence and domestic abuse, right? And it's a horror game, and I'm like, we're gonna play this game, and she played it, and she's like, wait, I thought RPGs were just nerds in the basement. I'm like, well, also true, but ¿por qué no les dos, right? I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. So I think we are trained because of the history of the game to think that this kind of game and this kind of way of exposition of games is the only way forward. And I'm trying to explore, what if we don't do that? Bloomfall is designed to be very accessible to first-time GMs and gamers. And it does use dice, but in a very light way, and it doesn't have those kinds of trappings. So I argue that we should, including me, because this is an exploratory essay, right? This is me thinking, what if we reframe our thought? I'm going to try and challenge myself more to be like, let's explicitly move away from that kind of thinking and see what wonderful music we make. That was a Dracula reference. Sorry.
One more last question very quickly. Yes.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was really interested when you were talking about fan fiction and talking about how the fan fiction author, they often don't have to deal with the hard work of character development because that's already being done in the original work.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of when people write fan fiction with, you know, the YN with like the reader in mind, or having like OCs, original characters. How then does the author have to do character development for their own characters or for the reader while still keeping in line with the character development and themes and tone of the original author? So how are they like creating that world in their head while also adhering to the world of the original author?
Yes. That is correct, right? That is the answer, right? I'm not a fandom studies scholar. I would never want to be a fandom studies scholar. The field is fascinating. The people are not. Not the scholars, the fans. They're horrible. One of my students like, I want to study fandom. I'm like, I'm so sorry. And she's like, what? I'm like, it's okay. Get your PhD. This is, you know who this is. Right, so the point I was making is specifically about fan fiction smut. That is most of the fan fiction that I access, right? I'm like, I'm horny, fan fiction smut. But it is actually interesting, the kind of work that goes into transformative media, and you should check out the Journal of Transformative Media, which is also founded by Naomi Novik, who founded Archive of Our Own, who also is a brilliant contemporary fiction, science fiction, fantasy writer. But yeah, there's a lot of different thought that goes into fan fiction. And one, I have argued in class settings, this was my class at Dartmouth, where I taught fandoms and transformative media, and I taught that in some ways, LARPing and TTRPGs and fan fiction use similar methodologies, right? So a lot of overlap, not my field, so read the journal, but yes, there's a lot of interesting things going on with how much of the character do we maintain, how much do we not, what happens if we make Harry Potter trans? Everyone's happy, right? Except for the person who doesn't matter, right? Like, that's a lot going on, and it's very cool, but I don't know that much about it. Apart from smut. I'll suggest some cool trans Harry Potter smut if you want.
Find Sharang later for the cool trans Harry Potter smut. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Sharang. This is an incredible talk.